back to another video. In this video, I will be discussing a further analysis into how guilt is the initial generator of faith. And in order to do so, I will be doing so by specifically pointing out that the Ten Commandments are in fact ways you should be learning to control the fear at the rate at which you're spending the guilt. Based on the guilt, you might see fears or moral compasses, which is meant to control your ability to essentially go from saying, from this decision, I choose to either fear or love the particular path that I choose in the direction I go. In the direction you either choose to go, whether it be a fork towards fear or a fork towards love, a fork towards temptation, or a fork towards virtue, you would then see that, for example, now if you look at the sixth commandment, it states to honor your mother and father, to honor your family, to not turn your back on your family. And you might say, based on the previous analysis of the guilt, which you as a child might feel within yourself, that somehow the weight of the guilt you feel as a result of your family, based on the guilt you feel due to your family, you must now realize the way guilt is shared or spent. If it is not the world that holds the guilt, it is I. And if it is not I that holds the guilt, it is the world. And in that particular statement, you then begin to understand the fundamental core value of faith, awakening to Christ. Because then you realize that if it is not you yourself that holds on to the guilt, then it is those around you that experience the guilt. And so as a good person, as a strong, faithed and spirited person, you are now responsible for being the pillar that separates the earth from the sky. You're now meant to be the pillar that upholds and holds that guilt upon yourself so that the world may not feel that upon themselves. This is the moment you awaken Christ within yourself. In the moment you awaken this particular way of life, this archetype, you will then begin to see that in your story, you will experience a great deal of suffering. In your emotions, you will feel a charging state where a constant pull of this karmatic flow of the chakras and the absorption of your emotions. This process of storing this guilt that the world may not experience. This process occurs over 33 years, the initial first 33 years of life, which at 33 years, the charging state of the guilt breaks loose and you snap. And the point of, at 33 years, every single individual in their life has a breaking point in life, a moment they must pivot from. And up until that point, you are technically not ready to be of a new stage, you could say. Because because from the birth moment up until 18, you are simply being oriented into the idea of what a human experience is. From 18 to 33, you're actively cultivating the guilt that which you are learning to hold upon yourself. At 33, you experience the break. The cup has filled, and now you overflow and you return back to the water, where you actively feel in yourself. At 33 years old, when you enter 33, you are so charged with guilt that you essentially experience a form of death. At 33 years old, the body's first physiological effects start to experience their first degeneration. You are entering the peak of life, but in order to enter the peak of life, you must first shed the body or the storing of guilt, that which you have stored upon yourself from the moment you were 18 to 33. But the entirety of from your birth to 33 is, in essence, each year represents a vertebrae, which each vertebrae represents the initial rising pole of the energy known as the awakening to Christ, which at 33 years old, you now awaken to what is known as faith. And the idea of teaching faith, the idea is to introduce it while the pupil is young, since they are very small, so they may develop a pathway or an understanding of at least a portion of the story to a certain degree. And the more and more and more the individual ages in their orientation, and then they further enter their 18 to 33 years in their orientation and the development of the depth of their faith in those early years, you would actually see that they would understand their process, a slight different orientation style, if you wish. If you look at the way a child that has grown up with a certain value of religion, whereas a child growing up without a value of religion, you would see a difference in their strength, in their ability to withstand or stand under the particular levels of guilt they experience upon themselves. A child that is grown up with religion might feel a deeper resonant state of guilt, whereas a child that grows up without religion feels a lesser state of guilt. But in the moral compass idea of things, we now must analyze the perspective of if you feel and don't feel guilt. Because if we can actively look at a person based on the psychoanalysis of, does that particular individual demonstrate symptoms of feeling guilt, or do they not show symptoms of feeling guilt, we can actively then pull apart what we would consider a danger within society. And if an individual does not feel guilt, we as a society can actively say that is not acceptable. But if we maintain the unacceptance of that particular individual within society, then we should uphold that particular unacceptance for all who are that particular nature. And so when we look now at the police force, governments, government officials, politicians, on and on and on, people who control and have the ability to change the fate of the world, when we look at simple laws now, such as regarding the development at which we are generating the guilt experience in our children, which means as parents we are now meant to be held accountable due to the level of guilt or the level of anger or fear that child either experiences within themselves or cause to experience within the world around themselves, because eventually that is the core fundamental test to you as a parent. If your child as a parent does not have the ability to control or hold on to not just the guilt itself, but fear itself, if they themselves do not have the ability to hold guilt or fear upon themselves so the world may not know it, well then I would argue that that is a poor reflection of your parenting style. And you might say that that is an over judgment regarding parenting. But I would argue that that is the most fundamental argument behind parenting, because if you yourself as a parent cannot have a child that not only can hold guilt within themselves, which they are not going around causing others to feel guilt based on the fact that they are not interacting properly, which means if a child is talking smack to your child and the child that is yours is unable to talk smack back because of the trauma they have experienced from you as a parent, which has stunted their ability to communicate now, I would argue that that is as a result of your poor parenting style. When you look now at the inability of the child to create relationships going forward based on the trauma the individual has experienced, where they are now unable to communicate with the external world in a healthy manner because you have stunted their ability to develop in their developmental years as a result of your poor parenting style, because they are spreading fear and spreading guilt amongst the rest of the world around them, because they cannot withhold it and withstand under their particular burden, which is you as the parent. You are the burden of that child. And so let's dive into the analysis of you as a parent. You yourself had your own story, your own predicaments. But in understanding your own predicaments, why is it that you chose the way you did? Which is, if your child is unable to withhold their guilt and fear upon themselves, it is as a reflection that you yourself as the parent could not do so yourself. Which begs the question, at which point should we introduce faith in people's lives in order to learn how to control holding that fear and guilt upon yourself so that you do not pass it to others around you? And the idea of Christ is the idea that one individual is not meant to be Christ, but all individuals are meant to be Christ. If in the notion when Moses asked God, "Who are you?" and God responds with, "I am that I am," meaning he is the self. What is the self? Well, when you look now at the name Jesus, which in French, in order to say je suis, I am, you are actually speaking Jesuit. Je suis. To say I am, you are actively speaking the name Jesus, which in the experimentation or explanation of self, the moment you introduce faith as a culture, you begin actively creating more Christ-like personalities within your culture, which is the idea of inviting faith within a culture. If it were to be a faith of Christian or Catholic belief. And in the idea of inviting more and more Christ-like individuals into society, the idea is to create a betterment, not a worsening, as we are seeing, which in the acceptance of the poor parenting styles based on the lack of good decision-making skills that the parents themselves had at that particular time, that which they raised those children, we can actively see now that the parents themselves are being essentially given a get out of jail free card, if you wish, based on the horrible way they were able to raise very poorly a human life. Meanwhile, the child himself is meant to suffer for the parents at that particular point. And so when we reflect upon this particular story, or this particular understanding, which is the true fundamental valor or value of faith, which is the ability of an individual to control the rate at which they hold not just guilt, but the fear upon themselves, so that the world around them may not experience it. It is an act of creating a return of a savior, which in the misunderstanding of religion, completely overlooking the true meaning behind this particular teaching, which is the idea that all people should be the return of the Savior. All people are a I am. I am Pat. Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? You are a self. You are a Christ. And an understanding that a Christ-like personality is an individual that holds not just the fear, but the guilt of themselves, so the world may not experience the guilt of the weight and the world of the fear and guilt of themselves. You see the alchemical transmutation, where you are actively pulling the sins out of people, choosing to hold them upon yourself, so that they may not hold that particular weight upon themselves. Now the problem is, in the story of Christ, he dies because the story is essentially meant to represent that there is meant to be a rebirth. And in the rebirth is not meant to be seen as a physical process. Because if it were, hello, Christ is already here then, because he was already reborn. He has seen the light and has come back from the light. But you're still not accepting him as a reborn Christ at that particular point, which from the jump of a 10-meter waterfall and diving into the holiest of grounds, a new Christ was born, which upon hitting the solid ground and being dead, arose and reborn the new Christ. That would, in essence, would be considered a form of the rebirth, should it not? But clearly we do not see it in that particular way because it's still not enough. It also has to be a metaphysical process, a rebirth in the mentality of the individual, which around 18 you experience a depression that leads to a certain depth in the negative aspect of your life, which not all from 18 to 20 make it. And then from the age of 30 to 33, we then see the shift from the initial rebirth of the initial incident between 18 to 20 as a developmental years, upon the initial death of the body or suicide attempts of our developmented children nowadays. In our modern day world, we see between the ages of 18 to 20, they first experience their first suicide attempt if they are a healthy person, typically around 18 to 20. And then between the years of 30 to 33 is when we see the shift in their character arc, where they now see and recover, if they choose to experience that rebirth in a mental, metaphysical process, if you wish, which is in their healing, they experience a rebirth, an arc, where they change, and if they survive that particular mental, metaphysical process, well, then they have earned their right on earth to live as a free individual once they learn to control the guilt and fear they hold upon themselves, so that the world around themselves may not experience it. Because you see, if we cannot place this particular measure in place, and we keep punishing people beyond that particular point, well, then the story of Christ was not a story of example in essence whatsoever if we do not adapt that mentality, if we continue punishing an individual beyond that year of 33 years of life. Which the more we punish an individual beyond that point, you might as well just kill them if that's the case. Because that is a true psychopathic nature, to continue punishing an individual beyond 33 years of their life. As a parent, or a government, or a society, or simply you yourself as an individual that might be listening, entering into the next stage of your life, where you then enter what is known as from childhood to adulthood into the next stage of evolution known as godhood. After 33 years of age, an individual typically experiences the awakening of Christ within themselves, where they experience the awakening of full spirituality. The final developmental stage of the brain's neural capacity occurs at 33 years old. It is when the full charging state of the nervous system has reached its height. And upon reaching this height, if an individual has made a successful initial point to making their life in the right trajectory, they would be given a good chance at life. But if the individual has been given a negative chance at life, then we must rehabilitate the individual at that particular point. But any factor that negatively affects an individual beyond their 33 years of individual life, I would argue, is the problems of society. which we should actively be seeking to lock away for the rest of life at that particular point if those problems continue beyond 33 years of age. Because if we can accept that treatment to someone who has made it in the world, then that means we accept that for all in the world, and now that individual that grows beyond 33 years is going to get to the point of, if my parents could do that to me at this stage of my life and get away with it, then that means I can do anything I want to anyone I want and get away with it and not face consequence, because my parents were not faced with consequence and result. And now you might see where your moral compass as a person might say, well, you are just a sick individual. And I would say, in my psychoanalysis of things, I would argue it is you that is the sick individual here. Thank you.